Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, on today's episode of Afternoon Light, I am joined by Dr. Stephen Chavura, who is a senior lecturer in history at Campion College and has authored, with others, The Forgotten Menzies, the world picture of Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister, and a book on reason, religion and the Australian Polity, a secular state, which will be largely the topic of our conversation today here at beautiful Campion College in Western Sydney. So lovely to be with you today, Steve.
Thanks for having me back on the show, Georgina.
Oh no, it's an absolute pleasure, and it's been a great adventure to come out here. This is my second time, I think, out west, which is now, I think, the centre of Sydney, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It's a beautiful campus, and it's a fantastic place to teach where sort of the liberal arts and the humanities are being kept alive in a way that's just really engaging for the students. So it's a beautiful privilege, actually, to teach here. I only wish it was around when I was an undergrad in the late 90s. Alas, it was not.
No, indeed. Well, it sounds like we're pretty much the same age, because I was also an undergrad in the late 90s and I studied at Melbourne University, which is a distinctly different sort of university. But I think it's really interesting to have a discussion on Australia as a secular nation and sort of the evolution of the religious side of Australia too, here in Western Sydney, which is the front line of demographic change, isn't it?
Absolutely. And Western Sydney, in some ways, it's not like sort of the inner city areas where a lot of sort of the loudest voices describing what Australia is would come from. So people who would work at, say, the ABC or the major newspapers would tend not to live out here in Sydney's west or the southwest. And so you might actually get a description of what Australia is like that doesn't really match what sort of the greater majority of Australians are actually like. So here out in the west, people will be more religious. In fact, my wife and I lived in Camperdown, right in the inner city, right near the ABC studios for about 13 years. And one thing I always noticed coming back out west, because I grew up in Bankstown, was that once you get past the suburb of Strathfield, you start seeing crosses and rosaries on people's cars, whereas when you're in the city, you see nothing like that. But the further out west you get, the more sort of religious iconography you start to see. I've just noticed that for years. It's different.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And actually, I was driving through the very northern suburbs of Melbourne last weekend on my way up to the Murray. And I noticed as the further north, but within the boundaries of Greater Melbourne, you'd see more and more, and it's an Islamic area. So, Islamic circumcision centres and mosques, very different from the inner city where you would see almost no evidence of religious institutions or iconography.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There are different Australias out there, and the danger is always describing Australia in such a way that it fits the nature of the person doing the describing, but the person doing the describing might actually be eccentric, sort of outside of the mainstream of what the majority of Australians would be like. But
is this where AI will come in handy? Because
well, it might. I mean, AI might actually
de-eccentricize the commentary.
It could actually. It might actually bring a kind of balance to a lot of the social commentary on Australia. I mean, historically, it's been very common to describe Australia as a very, very secular nation. But when you really look at Australian history, that description, again, might describe people in the media and people in academia. It's less adequate as a description for Australians historically, at least up until sort of the 1970s.
So you just mentioned this sort of idea of Australia as a secular nation. It's like a tightly held, I guess, prejudice in a way. But tell me about that. Can we unpack that? I mean, Australia as a nation does not have a state religion. We were established originally as colonies of Great Britain. Great Britain has its state religion, the Church of England, Anglicanism. After Catholicism these days, it's the single biggest religion in Australia. I'm an Anglican. But Australia was created as a secular country. There is a mention once, I think, in the preamble in the Constitution that one of the drafters of the Constitution, Patrick Glynn, put in to God, which is humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God.
Yes, that's correct.
But that's basically it, no reference to religion. So what was the basis of Australia as a secular nation?
Yeah, well...
And was that just a myth?
Well, the first thing we want to do is distinguish between a secular state or a secular government and a secular nation. So it absolutely is the case that the government and the Constitution were sort of designed in such a way that the government was never permitted to officially endorse any particular church or to force any religious observance on anyone. And if the Australian Constitution and the Australian government can be called secular, then it's really in that sense that there is no established church in Australia and Australians cannot be forced to participate in any kind of religious observance. I mean, the word secular, the term separation of church and state, these appear nowhere in the Australian Constitution. That the expression separation of church and state appears nowhere in the constitutional debates. The word secular appears in the constitutional debates around about 2 times, maybe 3. And that's in hundreds of pages of discussion on religious matters. The only thing, as you said, Georgina, the preamble says, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God. And that triggered a clause in the Constitution to make sure that that preamble couldn't somehow become a reason by which a religion could be forced onto Australians. And so that was Clause 116, which guarantees that the federal government will not force or prohibit any religious observance or establish a religious test for any sort of Commonwealth office. If you can call the Australian government secular, really all that means is that it is not establishing any particular church and it preserves religious freedom. Now, the notion of a secular nation is quite different because a nation is the people.
Yeah.
And I would say that you could probably say that Australia might have been established, the Commonwealth of Australia might have been established, say, in 1901 with a secular government or a secular constitution, but the nation itself was not secular. The reason there was that preamble referring to God is because the Federation conventions throughout the 1890s got thousands and thousands and thousands of signatures from all around Australia from people saying you must include God in the preamble, and if you don't include God in the preamble, we won't vote in favour of the Constitution.
And was that some sort of campaign?
It was a campaign by churches.
Right.
Now, we must remember that church attendance throughout the period of colonial Australia was very high. You're probably looking at around about 30% of people that went to church very regularly. If it was less than that, it wouldn't have been much less. It might even have been a bit higher. Numbers are hard to come by. But Australian society was quite a religious society up until 1862 in New South Wales, around about 1890, I think, in Western Australia. Churches were built by the colonial government. The colonial government paid for half the salary of ministers up until 1862. And
was that any church or just Anglican churches, Protestant churches? Were they paying for Catholic churches as well?
From 1836 in New South Wales, it was any church.
Right.
Which was quite controversial because there was a lot of sectarian rivalry between Protestants and Catholics. And this will sort of explain education funding. A lot of Protestants wanted all monetary funding to the churches cut because they would rather no church receive anything, even their own, rather than Catholics getting anything.
Right.
And as we'll probably see, one of the reasons that funding was cut to all religious schools in Australia during the colonial period was because a lot of red-hot Protestants in parliaments did not want Catholic schools to get any funding. They actually wanted Catholicism in Australia to die. And they thought if we could cut off the funding to the schools, the Catholics won't be able to keep them because they're too poor. They'll never be able to keep their own system. Of course, Catholics proved them wrong. But no, the actual nation in Australia was quite Christian. Christian belief was high. At around about 1900, there was about 96% of Australians who identified as Christians.
Well, I was looking at the census figures from 2021, and it was interesting to read the no religion category. And the caveat is the way they have assessed no religion has changed slightly over time. So we need to have that in the background. But in 1911, no religion, people identifying as having no religion, was 0.2%. By 1966, 0.8%. And in 2021, it was 38.9%. So between 1911 and 1966, so the first 55 years of our federation, of the nation of Australia, the Commonwealth of Australia, basically unchanged, no religion. So we were, as a nation, identifying with religion, be it largely Christianity, of course, and within that, largely Anglican.
Yes.
And then, of course, Catholic. But in that period, there was a sort of reasonable sense of stability, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. This is a period in Australia. Although Christianity is not the established religion, it is part of the establishment. So, all sort of national state ceremonies would involve some prominent clergy, a bishop or something like that. When you had royal commissions or parliamentary inquiries onto important issues of the day, you would always have a bishop or a clergyman on the committee to offer theological, moral guidance. And actually, very often these people were experts in a particular field. They may have had expertise in sociology, for example. The media regularly sought out the opinions of clergy, and it was very common for major newspapers to publish a sermon that might have been preached the Sunday beforehand. So sort of rates of church attendance were fairly high. So, for example, in 1967, the year after Menzies leaves office, those who attend church once a week is round about 20%. That's just once a week. The most famous survey that took place in the 60s on religion in Australia was the one by Hans Moll, published in 1971, but the survey was taken out in 1966. And in that survey, of all the Australians asked, around about 30% claimed that they went to church very regularly. I suspect it's probably a bit lower than that, but not much lower. When you look at sort of the stats that are available, you're looking at anywhere between sort of 26 to 30% of Australians that went to church very regularly, which would mean between once a week and once a month. So, look, Australia was quite religious in many ways right into the 1960s. And World War II was a period of religious revival all around the Western world. You would think during such a horrific thing, a lot of people would turn away from the churches, but in fact the opposite happened. Church attendances went up and religion was seen as even more important. And it's in 1959 that you have the Billy Graham crusades sweeping through Australasia, and Graham goes to the Melbourne cricket grounds and has about 130,000 people coming along, which I think even to this day is the largest crowd that's ever assembled there.
Yes, I don't think Ed Sheeran even made 130,000. I think he only got about 110,000 the other day. So there you go.
That's still pretty good.
Still Ed Sheeran.
Billy Graham, that's right. And so, Australia, and people used to come to Australia in the colonial period, prominent overseas visitors, and some of them would marvel at how many churches there were in Australia, and even suggest that Australians were, at the very least, as religious as the Britons.
I was interested in a comparison here. So if you say Australia in the, by the 60s was still very much a religious country, there was, what was the situation in Britain and America in similar sorts of countries, culturally similar?
Yeah, pretty similar. Basically what you find is that historians locate the really steep decline beginning in the later 60s.
Yeah.
And it's what one historian, Hugh MacLeod, and he's a sociologist as well, calls the religious crisis of the 1960s. And basically what seems to happen is between the mid, but especially late 60s and very pronounced during the 70s, is that you basically start to have the rapid onset of secularization, or sort of the decreasing public influence of institutional religion. And what are we talking about? We're talking about decreasing rates of church attendance. We're talking about decreasing rates of people identifying with Christianity or any religion, and probably decreasing rates of belief in doctrine and things like that. And so this really does start to kick in the mid to late 60s. Probably in Australia it kicks in a little bit later than elsewhere, but it's happening in Britain. It's happening to some extent in America, although America, comparatively speaking, remains very religious compared to Australia or Britain.
I mean, without having the figures in front of me, that is my sense. You know, I can observe that when you go to America, it seems a much more religious society, and leaders tend to be affiliated with religion much more publicly than you find in Australia, where if a prime minister or a leader declares some religious belief or goes to church regularly, that seems to be treated with a degree of heavy scepticism in Australia. Like, well, what's wrong with you? You know?
Yeah, or, I mean, maybe heavy scepticism by the media and probably, I think, indifference by Australians. I think what Australians tend not to like, these days at least, is very enthusiastic religion, but they also I don't think they have a lot of time for very enthusiastic irreligion or atheism either. So Julia Gillard was, I think, our first openly atheist Prime Minister. I think I'm right about that. But she knew never to make an issue of it, because Australians are basically passionate about sport. They're passionate about a few other things, but I see sort of modern Australia maybe more as indifferent to religion rather than outright hostile, although if you try to whip up a kind of enthusiasm among Australians, then you sort of can get some pushback. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously something changed between sort of the late 60s and today. And the big question that historians have always asked is, what happened?
Yeah. Well, a lot happened in the 60s socially. Yeah. But I always think life begins and ends with education. It's so important. It shapes you. It provides you with both the good and the bad experiences that set you up for life, I think. And you did talk earlier about funding for churches and education, state funding. It's interesting to look at the way the Australian state school system has been established and how it is funded versus, say, the British system, which I have a vague knowledge of. In Britain, you can send your children to a publicly funded Church of England school. My sister sends her little girls there. And that's your state school. But it is C of E, and you do, I guess, get some element of religious education through that. In Australia, our schools are, if they're public, they are secular, entirely secular. You obviously have state aid coming through for independent and non-government schools to support the religious schools and other schools. But in terms of if you want to go to the, I don't know, we're in Toongabbie, the Toongabbie State School, primary school, it's not going to be religious.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, you're right. Sort of in normal school hours, you're not going to get religious instruction, or at least, let me put it another way, you're not going to get Christian instruction. You might get all sorts of ideological instruction. I think there's a new religion of sort of diversity going around today, and I think that's got a kind of cult-like hold on schools. But we must remember that you still have scripture classes, which these days are opt-in here in New South Wales, I believe. So, I mean, when the secular systems start to emerge in the 19th century, the word secular did not mean the absence of religious instruction from schools. It meant that the school curriculum would not discriminate really against Catholics in favour of Protestants. And so most schools, and I think this is actually the intention behind most of the laws, and I've sort of written on this elsewhere, the idea was that even sort of the public secular education would provide religious instruction for those who wanted it. And that was even carried on in normal class hours as well. So it wasn't unusual, even in schools in Victoria, that in normal class hours, not special classes set aside for scripture, but normal class hours, you'd read portions of the Bible. It's sort of a forgotten fact now that in Victoria, South Australia and Queensland, there were actual state referenda on whether to have the Bible taught in normal class hours. And Victorians can hold on to their hats right now because the Victorians voted yes, that the Bible should be taught. And that was when their schools were called secular. And so in the mind even of Victorians in the early 20th century, a secular system didn't mean a non-Christian system. It just meant a system that wasn't specifically Protestant or specifically Catholic. It just sort of taught the basics of Christianity. They thought, anyway, everyone could agree with. The Catholics had a different opinion. They thought it was really just concealed Protestantism.
Yeah, and there probably was some argument for that.
Oh, there is.
But there was a utilitarian overlay to this, wasn't there? So Australia was a geographically very, very big country, relatively sparsely populated. If you were going to fund schools, you needed the schools to accommodate all the children in the village or the town or the community, rather than have a school for the Anglicans, a school for the Presbyterians, a school for the Methodists, a school for the Catholics.
Yes, and a church too.
And churches as well. So that utilitarianism, which is very much part of the Australian identity and ethos, was pervasive back then too when it came to how you educate children in terms of religious affiliation or not.
Very much so. I mean, our education system became quite utilitarian, if you like, in two respects. One of them was, yes, it was becoming extreme utilitarian in the sense of really just, we've got to be practical about this. And we can't be building 4 schools in every town, one for the Prezies, one for the Anglicans, one for the Catholics, one for the Methodists. It's just too expensive.
Yeah.
And so sort of the practical, maybe utilitarian approach was, okay, well, we'll just have to build one school for them all to go to. But another thing that Australians believed quite strongly was that for society to be moral and happy, you needed Christianity, you needed religion, and you needed Christianity. And so on the one hand, you wanted to sort of lower the costs of education by being able to have all children in a single school in a town. But on the other hand, everyone believed that children have to be taught morals. And in the 19th and throughout the first half of the 20th century and beyond, the idea that you would teach morals apart from religion made no sense for most people. I mean, to some philosophers, it made sense. But the average person and the average politician did not believe that. They believed that if you're going to teach children morals, it has to be, morals have to come from somewhere. And so you teach them about God, you teach them the Bible, you teach them about Jesus. And as like today, children are taught morality in public schools. They're taught about human rights. They're taught about tolerance and that kind of thing. So we're just as moralistic about our students today. It's just the morals have changed and they're now sort of derived from United Nations conventions and all sorts of things. But in the 19th century, Christianity was considered of great social utility because it makes people moral. And what kind of society would you rather live in? A society where people are immoral or a society where people are moral?
But this is an interesting point to pick up on, Steve, because this idea that Australia is a utilitarian society, that we do focus on the greatest good for the greatest number when making decisions, versus the idea that you learn, you say have a liberal education course. We're here at Campion College, it's very focused on that, where you learn some things that are not actually going to necessarily get you a job at the end or not necessarily have a utilitarian outcome in mind, but it's sort of a nourishing, nurturing side to that. It does fill you with morals and ethics and guide you through the course of life, enable you to think critically and broadly.
Yes.
But what's the outcome of that? So Menzies was very much an advocate, as you know, a liberal education, and for all the things I've just described, that it shouldn't just be about vocation and getting a job at the end, that we should create an educated nation so we can engage in our democracy in the best possible way. But that comes at a cost, and it's not for everyone. So how did he triumph over, I guess, more utilitarian advocates?
I don't know that he did. I think in hindsight we can see that Menzies' vision that universities would be about sort of sweetness and light, that is, that they would teach the more, say, utilitarian disciplines, economics, science, technology. But as you said, Georgina, Menzies had this quite beautiful vision that the scientist and the economist would go to poetry classes and would go to Shakespeare classes as well. And he thought it would kind of bring a sort of humanity to the experts. Because, I mean, Menzies was typical of his age. After World War II, the big question was, how are we going to reconstruct the world based on all the new scientific discoveries we've discovered during the war? How can we improve things? And so Menzies believed, like most people, that you do need a class of technocrats who are going to sort of help sort of shape society in a way that's appropriate for the second half of the 20th century. But Menzies wanted these technocrats to have an appreciation for truth, beauty and goodness. He didn't just want them to be mathematicians and scientists with no understanding of what is truly meaningful in life. And he gave many speeches, even to universities, on this very, very topic. And this sort of almost brings us back to the issue of secularization, because Menzies knew that Australian society was changing. He could see that after World War II, we were becoming far more technological, we were becoming far more affluent. And one of the themes in his speeches in the 40s, 50s and 60s was essentially, as we become more technological, as we become more wealthy, as we become more sort of utilitarian, don't forget the things that make civilization good. Not just the things that make it fast or the things that make it prosperous, but the things that make us good. And for Menzies, that was religion, but it was also an appreciation of high culture. And Menzies tended actually to see the university, probably more than the church even, as sort of the great preserver of sweetness and light in culture, just an appreciation for beauty, an appreciation for excellence. And so in that respect, that was Menzies' vision. But it's pretty clear what happened to universities after Menzies finished office. They increasingly became radicalized by Marxist theorists, particularly the humanities departments, something Menzies could sort of see beginning to happen. Menzies was no fool. He knew what was going on in his country. He wasn't a dictator either. He wasn't going to just control everything the way he wanted it. And the other thing that, of course, happens in universities is they become far more vocationally oriented, to the point where once you get to the 1990s, classics departments are closing down, history departments are merging with politics departments, and the liberal arts is just on the wane.
And we have job-ready graduates.
Exactly. You've got job-ready, future-proof graduates who are very clever, but don't really have much of an understanding of the nature of Western civilization, or if they do, it's very much through a kind of Marxist postmodern lens. So it's really a purely critical view, not a view that appreciates it.
Steve, you've written a book about Menzies and his philosophical views. You call him a cultural Puritan.
Yes. I wrote that with Greg Maluish.
You did, who's a professorial fellow of the Robert Menzies Institute. Good. And writing another book, which I'm very excited to read, hopefully next year, for us. But in terms of Menzies' own spirituality, I'd be interested in your views on that, because he was a man of his time. He saw himself as a British subject. That was just the Australian identity of the era. He was, I think, typically religious for the era as well. I don't think he was especially diligent at going to church, although he did. He did occasionally speak as a lay preacher at the Wesley Church in Melbourne. He was an attendee of Scots Church in Melbourne, of course. But in terms of his own spirituality, how did that influence his thinking around the good in society and, of course, in education, you've explained?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not an easy question to answer. You know, from sort of reading Menzies' diaries, reading his speeches, and just reading those who knew him, my conclusion is that Menzies had a sincere belief in probably the essential doctrines of Christianity, although it would be too far to say that he was someone whose belief never wavered. For example, you know, when we look at surveys from sort of the time of Menzies, say the survey from 1966 that I mentioned earlier, 52% of Australians believed in God without doubt. So most Australians believed in God without doubt, but that means that there are a lot of other people who believe in God but with some doubt.
Sure.
It's an age of high belief, but it is also an age where there is still some doubt. So Menzies, in my opinion, was probably a sincere Christian. Exactly how orthodox he was in his beliefs, I don't think anyone really knows. He definitely did not believe that the Bible should be read literally. That's a fact, because he mentions that in his 1935 diary. His Christianity tended to be a tremendous appreciation for the Christian tradition, its aesthetic achievements, its buildings, its music, the services and things like that, but also a tremendous and a very vocal appreciation for just the contribution that Christianity and Christian ideas, particularly the belief in God as a creator and we as bearing his image, that these are very important for any good civilization. And in that respect, he was very much a man of his age as well. So Menzies was very vocal throughout his whole career that religion is sort of foundational for morality, and it's foundational for a good society. As early as 1945, he's saying that we need to have a reinvigoration of religion in our public schools. Very soon after getting into office in 1952, he gets into office, of course, again in 1949, but by 1952, he's already creating tax breaks for people who send their children to denominational schools. And I don't think that was just a class thing. Menzies just ingratiating himself with the upper classes. Menzies had a history before that of saying that religion is important for education, it's important for morality. And I think that's actually one of the reasons he re-establishes state funding to education. The law is passed in 1963. Now, many say, well, that was just an attempt to curry favour with Australian Catholics. Now, I don't want to completely deny that. You don't stay in office for over 16 years because you're politically naive.
No, not at all.
But Menzies, for decades, had been saying that religion is very important in education. Menzies was not an anti-Catholic. And when you read histories of why denominational funding was cut off, most of the histories point out that a lot of it had to do with hostility towards Catholics. And so we'd rather no one get anything than Catholics get anything. And so I think Menzies' sincere Christianity led him to believe very strongly that religion in education was an important thing. And I think that probably had quite an influence on him re-establishing funding to all denominational schools, which begins again in 1964. And you can't understand Menzies' social and political thought without recognizing and appreciating that he thought that Christianity and just a spiritual life was just incredibly important for a good society. That was a huge theme of his whole political career. And I think in some ways that was one of the things he really wanted to try to reinvigorate in Australia.
I wondered, Steve, if you could comment on the importance of British identity in this as well. Because as you see religious identification in Australia tapering off, as it does elsewhere as well, from the late 60s, you're also seeing that sort of sense of Britishness tapering off in Australia. We've had the end of empire. There is a connection between all these cultural, moral traditions coming out of England, coming out of Britain into Australia, the connection with religion through those ideas as well of morality and ethics. But as that sort of sense of British connection and identity dissipates in Australia, so we see religion doing the same thing. Is that a correlation? Perhaps is not causation, but how can you explain that?
It's very difficult. The sense of Britishness in Australia survives much longer than the 1960s. I think Australia, well into the 80s, is still very British. You and I remember what was on television in the 1980s. A lot of it was British sitcoms. And that sort of
Towers,
thing. Fawlty Towers,
Tyson, Blackadder.
Bless This House, George and Mildred. You and I grew up watching The Goodies on the ABC.
Yeah.
And Australia was still cricket mad. So the strong British inflection to sort of our cultural character is there and still very strong into the 80s. And yet by the time you're getting into the 80s, the sort of rates of church going and Christian belief have plummeted a lot. So it'd be kind of difficult to argue that a decline of a sense of Britishness caused a decline of a sense of Christian identity. Even the British were losing their Christian identity, in the 60s and 70s. How do you explain the decline of the social influence of Christianity in Australia? People at the time, and historians have often sort of concurred with this, attribute it to a few things that you wouldn't normally think of. So, for example, one of the things taking place in the 1960s is that families are increasingly buying cars. So the rise of the personal family car. In 1953 up to 1962, car ownership rose from 1 in 5 people had a car to 1 in 3. The family car really starts to become prominent from the mid-60s onwards. And now what that meant is that once you have a family car, you can do something on a Sunday other than go to church.
Sure, yeah.
And so it was a form of escape. And clergy at the time noticed that. The other thing that explodes, particularly in the 60s in Australia, is television. By the time you get to 1966... 9/10 of households in Australia have a television. And that's tremendous competition with church going. So you've got television, you've got the rise of the car. You've also got the dismantling of Sabbatarian laws on Sundays, which stop cinemas from being open, which stop sports games from, so those are being dismantled as well. And then you've just got the other aspect of the 1960s, sort of the people at the time called the new morality. And particularly after World War II, you start getting different ideas on morality coming sort of from philosophers, social engineers, if you like, and our understanding of sort of sexual morality, gender relations, issues of life, they start to change also during the 50s and the 60s. Issues like abortion, issues like sex outside of marriage, monogamy, and the huge one was the contraceptive pill. The contraceptive pill really changes everything. Once it starts to become available in 1961, 1962, that just changes everything over a course of a generation.
And what about the situation for women too in society? Because we see through that period dramatic changes, many more women joining the workforce than had before, entering tertiary institutions, graduating, so becoming much more educated, being able to access childcare outside of the home, so being able to continue to work if they get married and have children. That must have had a dramatic change on the society, but also those sort of spiritual dynamics as well.
Well, the historian Callum Brown wrote a whole book, and he basically argued that women entering the workforce and just changing notions of femininity from the 60s onwards is the single greatest cause of secularization. Because, as the old saying goes, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And essentially what historians like to point out is that children historically have learned religion from their mothers, at their mother's knee, or sort of mother reading stories to them, mother teaching them to read from the Bible and that sort of thing. One of the traditional roles of motherhood was to pass religion on to the children. And when women do start going to work, there's sort of less time for that sort of thing. But the other thing is that just the moral beliefs of Australians and indeed Westerners start to shift in the mid to late 60s and especially in the 70s and 80s. And what you get are moral beliefs and beliefs on gender roles which start more and more to depart from traditional Christian ways of thinking about whether it's sex, whether it's about the nature of marriage, whether it's about male headship in the home. One of the aspects of the sexual revolution of the 60s was basically to seek to overturn traditional Christian ways of thinking about sexual morality and gender relations. And so the more that women were touched by the sexual revolution and its ideas, the more they seem to see sort of traditional Christianity as something at best old-fashioned and irrelevant, or at worst positively oppressive.
So how was 1960s, 70s feminism sitting with Christianity?
Not well.
Right.
Not well. I mean, Christianity to most second wave 1960s and 70s feminism was seen as part of the problem.
Yep.
Germaine Greer sees it as part of the problem in her 1970 book, The Female Eunuch, because second wave feminism was about sexual liberation. It was about liberation from marriage, liberation from the family, and sort of sexual morality, monogamy, the sanctity of home life. I mean, Menzies' Forgotten People speech, home spiritual, very much in praise of the Australian home, which in the 1940s greatly appealed to women. Menzies, as you know, was very popular with women because unlike a lot of Labor rhetoric tended to be about the workplace, Menzies brought it into the home. And of course, women could identify with that. And so they really warmed to him. But by the time you get to the late 60s, with the rise of second wave feminism, Christianity is seen as one of the causes of sexual repression, one of the causes of women sort of being trapped in marriages that they couldn't escape from. And so with the rise of feminist ideas, what you get is a separation of Christianity and, in a way, public morality. As morality changes in the 60s and 70s, you get this separation. And where we are today is that traditional Christian biblical morality, whether you're Protestant or Catholic or Orthodox, they are seen as so foreign to the way we think about sexual morality today that they are almost seen as dangerous. And that's why we're discussing religious freedom again today, because Christianity is now seen as something almost, well, actually, in some ways quite harmful.
Well, yes, very much a subculture. It's outside of the mainstream, which is interesting because in 2021, 43.9% of people said they were Christian in Australia. If my figures are the same as yours, Steve, I'm looking at here.
Yep.
So 38.9% said no religion, 3.2% said Islam, 2.7% said Hindu, 2.4% said Buddhist. We had seen since the previous census in 2016 a decline in Christianity, an increase in other religions, of course, that reflects migration trends, and an increase in no religion. But what I found very interesting was that I think for the first time ever, the number of Catholics exceeded the number of Anglicans within the Christian cohort of 43.9% for the first time. So that's interesting. But it also, I think, reflects a trend that Catholicism has been a bit more sticky than the Protestant Christian denominations. And why is that? Why have Catholics withstood the trends more so than the Protestant denominations? It's something about Catholicism that...
Again, that is a very tough question to answer. I think in some ways, Catholicism... In some ways, it culturally demands more than Protestantism demands. I mean, Catholicism demands of its adherents to be educated within sort of the Catholic mindset, so Catholic schools. If you can send your children to Catholic schools as a Catholic, you are meant to do that. There is just more involved in being a good Catholic. That is, you turn up to Mass, you turn up to confession, you do penance and things like that. And probably Catholicism has a greater sense of community in some ways than Protestantism. And I think uniquely in the Australian context, I think this is probably quite important. Catholics were a persecuted minority in Australia right up into the 1960s and even beyond. Like, anti-Catholicism in Australian history is real. I would actually say it still persists to this day. You saw it with the way Pell was treated. You even saw it with the way Tony Abbott was treated. They called him the Mad Monk. So I think there is this lingering cultural anti-Catholicism in Australia. It's just lingering now. And that is actually a part of lingering Britishness. Because we've got to remember, to be British was to be anti-Catholic.
Sure.
And that had a lot to do with Irish republicanism and that kind of thing. And during this process of secularisation during the 60s, 70s and 80s, Catholicism did fare better. Catholics were more likely to go to church. They were more likely to retain traditional beliefs, for sure. And I think that's partly because Catholics formed tighter communities in Australia, because they were a minority and they were openly and secretly, if you like, maybe not secretly is the right word, but certainly openly persecuted in Australia. And nothing creates community and a sense of identity than being persecuted outsider. So I think that's got something to do with it. And maybe there's an element of Protestantism that lends itself also to secularisation. And one thing, when you think of the most secular countries in the world, the ones that have just thrown away sort of traditional morality and Christianity, it's hard not to notice that they tend to be historically Protestant countries, whether it's England, whether it's the Netherlands, Australia. The exception would be America. America's just its own weird thing with most things anyway. And I suppose there's a whole conversation you could have about why America has maintained a lot of Christianity. Although we've always got to, with America, there are different Americas, and New York and San Francisco are not the same as Oklahoma and Texas and that sort of thing. But some would say that Protestantism tends to be more individualistic, tends, I suppose, to place a heavier emphasis on maybe the subjective. And once you start doing that, it's very easy for people just to fall away completely. Protestantism has the Bible, Catholicism has the church. And it might turn out that the church has been far more effective in maintaining its sense of authority over Catholics historically than the Bible has for Protestants. So the whole bunch of things. It's not an easy question to answer.
I thought I'd end our discussion today, Steve, by asking you to reflect, and this is a question without notice, apologies, on some writings by Greg Sheridan, who's the Australian newspaper's foreign editor. But he's also written quite a bit on God and religion. And he makes the argument that you basically cannot be a moral, liberal society without religion. You have to have Christianity, he believes, but at least God, to give moral sustenance. And that when you take that away, there's little left and you're basically doomed. I mean, he is optimistic that people will find Christianity. And it's interesting in the census data, when you look at it, while younger people are less Christian and less religious. As they get older, they do become more religious. I wonder if that's because you're nearing death, so you're looking around for more meaning and hope for eternal life, potentially. But I'm no theologian, so I won't speculate anymore. But what is the future for an Australia where the trends have been quite strikingly in the direction of no religion, and particularly so in the last 15 years when you look at the census data? There's sort of been a plummet of identification with religion and a quite sharp uptick in no religion. Yeah. How do you respond to Greg's prognosis that without religion we can't really exist as a good society?
Well, that is a very common belief historically. I mean, the Greeks and the Romans believed the same thing. I mean, this is the thing with morality. It's one thing for someone to say, I can be moral without religion. I don't need God to be moral. But morality isn't just about me committing myself to be a good boy. Morality is also about me demanding that you be a good girl. We want other people to be moral too.
Yes.
In fact, we don't just want it, we demand it. In fact, if they're not, we'll see that they're punished for it. And the question is, on what grounds does anyone have the right to see that other people are punished for not living up to morality? And it's hard to come up with any kind of justification for why we would have the right to punish other people for living the way they want to live without some transcendent law that all human beings are subject to, and that we don't just invent. I mean, if we just invented our own morals, then there's a kind of arbitrariness about them. It's like, why should I obey? I invented it. I brought it into existence. I'll just disregard it. It's nothing. For morality to have the kind of normative force that's strong enough for us to actually put people in prison for doing horrible things, it needs some kind of transcendent metaphysical anchor. And it's hard to think of a better one than a personal, all-good, all-wise lawgiver. Because without that, what are you left with? Just social consensus. There's no such thing as social consensus. And here's the evidence. We have prisons. Not everyone consents to living a moral life.
Yeah.
And so social consensus won't do it. And moral relativism, everyone can just do what they want, live and let live. Well, no one really believes that. I mean, people like to do what they like, but they don't want other people to do whatever they want, because that will affect, So I think Greg is probably correct. Now, if religious belief continues to decline in Australia, well, the first thing I would say is that I would want to draw a distinction between Christian belief and religious belief, because I do believe that we as human beings do need meaning in our lives. And I don't think it's an accident that as Christianity has declined over the last 50 years, social justice and wokeism has inclined. And I think modern day wokeism, and I think Marxism among the intellectuals in the 60s and 70s, is a surrogate for Christianity. I think there's something that's filling the void. And so I think it's not so much that we're becoming less religious. I think the religion is shifting. And so what can I see sort of happening in Australia? Well, it's hard to tell. I'm not a prophet. But I can definitely see increasingly quite sort of left-wing social justice, wokeism, getting more inroads into schools, into workplaces, because might not be much effective opposition. And I think what that might do is actually lead a lot of people to say, hey, wait a second, this is all pretty weird. I'm now being punished for thinking that they're only boys and girls, and that's it. And they might start thinking, where did we go wrong? And that might actually, it wouldn't surprise me that sort of the march of wokeism actually reinvigorates an interest in Christianity. And I think it's actually happening around the world. It's certainly happening in America. The whole Jordan Peterson movement is a kind of response to the woke movement that's arisen over the last few decades, and it is turning a lot of people back to Christianity. And so it wouldn't actually surprise me if we start to see some more of a rise, particularly among young people, in interest in Christianity, because Christianity now, it's weird now. It's countercultural, it's punk rock. And I think that over time might actually to appeal to a lot of people. But also Australia being Australia, I think another thing that if Australians can continue to be comfortable, prosperous, if there's enough beer in the fridge, if there's enough sport on television, enough shows on Netflix, I think Australia can just plod along, not really caring about all that much. And that's, I'm sorry to say, very Australian, until some great catastrophe happens. And I don't know what that will be. But I can see Christianity making a comeback. I don't know if it will be anytime soon, but I tend to sympathise with what Greg Sheridan is saying. I do think we look for meaning, and if there is an objective meaning out there, and I think there is, I am a Christian, I think a lot of people will find it. Not everyone, but a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Steve Chavura, for that fantastic discussion. I think it's given me, and I'm sure our listeners, a huge amount of food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.